Good evening and welcome to the Nonprofit Management Program's latest masterclass in our series. This is our fall 2020 masterclass, and we are so grateful to have our featured guest speaker this evening. We've got Dr. Lucy Bernholz speaking, as you can see, on digital civil society and democracy, how we got here and where we need to go. Our nonprofit management program hosts all sorts of luminaries. Once a semester, we've brought them in to come and talk about major issues within our nonprofit sphere. I'm Cindy Lott. I'm the academic director, and I'm full-time faculty here at the program, and I am so pleased that we have so many of you joining us. Please know that we will also be recording this and posting it as we have all of our master classes on our website. So please check that out and follow us on social media for our upcoming events, including our next masterclass in the spring. So I want to welcome Dr. Bernholz, Lucy, to me, and to those of you who already know her. She's extremely well known in the field. She's with Stanford now. She's had her graduate degree from there, undergraduate from Yale. Historian by training, and she has moved into all sorts of other overlapping spheres, including with civil society. At Stanford, she's a research fellow, and she's a director of the Philanthropy and Civil Society, PACS, as is well known. She works on all sorts of publications. She is prolific. For those of you that have taken a class with me, you are always reading something from Lucy through the semester. She's written any number of books, and she has a forthcoming one that we will put in the chat. We also have a discount code in case any of you is interested in going ahead and purchasing that at some point. And she also writes, quite famously, The Blueprint, which is both an aggregation and a forecasting tool in our space that she puts out annually. She has a very famous blog. For those of you that have not followed that will also be put up. It's linked in her bio. And she had a series with the Chronicle of Philanthropy that I believe, Lucy, you said you've now completed, but it is posted at the Chronicle as well. So we have all sorts of different topics that we could have asked Lucy to speak on tonight. It is a perfect topic for our election season, and it is extremely timely for other reasons as well, including a lot of the racial equity issues that are going on in the country right now. As we know, technology has a huge impact on small d democratization of speech and how people interact, who gets to speak, where they get to speak. Is also reflected through our technologies and digitization. So lots of different overlapping circles there in that Venn diagram around society, nonprofits, policy, and technology. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Bernholz. She's going to speak for roughly 45 minutes, and we are going to have Q&A. I will be moderating that Q&A. If you have a question that you would like to see addressed, please submit your question through the Q&A tab specifically at the bottom of your screen. And if you would like to just put something in the chat box for the good of the order, everyone will be able to see it. Feel free to also put something in the chat. That, again, will be public. The Q&A will not, but will come directly to me. So we'll have that at the end. And with that, I want to thank you again, Lucy, for joining us. Can't wait to hear.
Thanks. Thank you, Cindy, and thank you so much to the Backstage team at Columbia for having me. It's really a delight to go home to New York. I'm a native New Yorker, relocated to the occupied lands of the Muwekma Ohlone people here, and otherwise known as San Francisco. One quick point of clarification, I'm not actually the director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. I'm the director of the Digital Civil Society Lab, which is part of the broader center. So just to clear that up. And I'm really delighted to be here. This is a brand new talk, so we'll be learning together, and I really do take the word class seriously, so I hope you'll engage at the end of the talk with some questions, and we'll get a chance to talk to one another. So Cindy asked me to talk about how we got here and where we need to go. It's a really powerful framing, because by now you've probably been invited to a whole lot of events or conversations about technology and elections, or how the political campaigns are using digital data, and all of that is important. Don't get me wrong, we're in an absolutely critical moment in American history, but I want to expand your worldview a little bit as we think about democracy and this thing called digital civil society. So the first thing I really ask you to do is to think about what democracy is. This partial definition here of it as a concept involving the ideals of political inclusion and equality probably resonates with many of you. You'll notice it says nothing about elections or voting machines, but it also happens that that ethos of democracy, as described by Michael Hanchard, is also tied very closely to an ethnos of democracy, which is about the reality of exclusion and hierarchy that winds all the way through certainly the American experience of democracy. So while I'm a fan of democracy, I think it's worth pursuing. I think it is the experiment we're all engaged in. It has never been perfect. It has never been all inclusive. So let's a little bit about where it comes from. I mean, one of the many ways in which this democracy of ours has never been fully inclusive is ironically from the very people whose land we stole. This is a map of the Iroquois nations. We also borrowed, not a problem, but we borrowed many of the core ideals of their method of governance, mixed them with some white European Enlightenment ideals, and did all this very much in the context of values and norms and political power of the time. So a very idea of a democracy as a inclusive, participatory system, by definition, inclusion has an exclusionary component to it. And I hope everyone on this call is quite familiar with the ways from the very beginning, this country's systems have excluded whole swaths of our populations, people and communities, from Blacks to women to the indigenous people from whom we actually took the land to begin with. So as we think about democracy, we should also remind ourselves, we should be very grounded, I think, in the reality of what we're talking about and how we've implemented. Nothing that we see today in terms of voter suppression or electoral malfeasance or gerrymandering or any of these topics or misinformation getting in a lot of attention, very important, but they are not new. They are in many ways baked into the very system we're talking about. So with that in mind, it may be time to think differently about democracy itself. And Sarah Song has a book out, this is a year or two old now, I think, that offers a very different structure for thinking about what it means to be a citizen. And that is something that would be based not on who you are, but on what you do. And in her book, she's making the case for rethinking a framework to think about immigration. But I think this idea is very compelling, that in fact, political membership derives from collective action, what you do, not who you are. So I want to offer right up at the start, as I proceed to attempt to bring 50 or 60 years of history into a 45-minute conversation, that we think about democracy in a slightly different way, at least for the course of this hour, rather than getting kind of focused in on its mechanical instantiations, particular political parties, certain candidates, all kinds of behavior, rather than think about that, but to broaden your mind, to think a little bit bigger about what democracy would be. And that we think of it as having a spatial component to it, in which we are, in fact, pursuing these values or ideas of participation, equality, self-governance. And I'm being very specific when I say I want you to think about it as a space, because we're going to talk a bit about the intersection of democracy and the digital world, and that what becomes a metaphor of space becomes very important in understanding how we got to where we are. It's also important to recognize that if you think back to the American democratic experience and all of those groups who were excluded explicitly at the beginning of the country's history and are still in many ways being excluded in perhaps different ways presently, the effort to get from complete exclusion crafted in the founding document of the country to a place where voter suppression still happens and exclusion is still very real for, say, Black people in this country, but it's no longer embedded in that founding document. It takes a different takes a different form, one has to ask oneself, well, if you're excluded at the beginning, how do you get to be included? And that's where civil society comes into the picture. But when we think about our democracy, we have the formal systems of government and governance and the process by which people and parties and platforms are put in power. But how do they get there? How do we move the idea that our franchise, for example, should be expanded to include all people as full people of any race, of any gender? How did we get there? Well, that is the work that starts in this space immediately adjacent to the formal functionings of government, a space that we think of as civil society. And it is in this space where our mobilizing and our organizing and our protesting and expressing a different vision of what we want our democracy to be and who we want it to include. That's where it happens. In other words, civil society is the where that we change and make our democracy and our formal government systems better, or to one of the places from which we do this. And the how has to do with some of those core other ideas that weren't mentioned earlier, but that we find in the First Amendment to the Constitution, ideas such as assembly and association, expression, and protest. So when we're thinking about digital civil society and democracy, I want to immediately set your mind to thinking of these as adjacent in many ways and in many domains overlapping spaces that are designed. There are rules for how those spaces work. And then within those design spaces, we take certain actions. And then setting us all up for how we think about where we are now, as I start from where we began and in pursuit of the question Cindy gave me of, well, how did we get here? So how did we get here? Well, here's where we are. These are mailing machines in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a few months ago, dismantled and set outside to not be used in a mail-in election in a pandemic. So voter suppression takes many forms. Messing with elections takes many forms. Efforts to impede electoral participation takes many forms. Just as it took certain forms back in the 1780s, it takes interesting and forms we need to be ever watchful for here in 2020. And of course, I actually thought hard about this slide because the truth of the matter is I could have put all kinds of pictures here from just this morning, let alone, or yesterday, let alone August, of various forms of taking action to limit the franchise and determine who actually gets a say in our so-called democracy. That's where we are now. We're not in some fancy other place that we'd like to be. We can aspire to make our democracy better, but I think it's very important when we think about digital civil society and democracy that's where we are. It's a profoundly broken system that's never actually materialized its own rhetoric. Doesn't mean that's the only place we are. I want you also to shift your mind now from thinking about democracy as a concept and these values and this space in which we pursue them to talk a little bit about where we are technologically. And there's no better example of where we are technologically than the one that we are literally in technologically, which is Zoom. And I want to talk a little bit, because understanding digital civil society involves understanding software and technology and hardware in a political economic sense, not in an actual software coding kind of sense. But by now, as whatever day it is, October 15th, 2020, you probably have spent more time in Zoom than you either ever thought you would or ever wanted to. We've all been here. We're here now. We know the boxes. We know the chat bars. We've all heard all too often, you're on mute. We're all too familiar with forms of collective action, such as Zoom bombing, not a particularly positive form of action. And I'm going to guess that those of you who are here tonight have, in the course of the last 7 months, if not prior to that, adopted a whole new set of small behaviors just to go to your classes, or to oversee your kids' learning, or to go to work, or to community meetings, to come to events like this, or to go participate in your worship community if you're a member of one. You've adapted to living in Zoomland. And some of you may have assumed that whatever Zoomland says is what is the way it has to be. It's the only way we could possibly do this. Some of you may think, oh no, wait a minute, we have choices. I could go over there to Google Hangouts or Microsoft Teams or something like that. So yeah, you could do this same functionality of my talking with you from San Francisco to New York or wherever you might be, where you can see me and we're all operating in this video conference world. But all of those choices are corporate owned spaces, if you will. And probably all of you have thought, regardless of which platform you're actually using, Zoom, Teams, Hangouts, whatever, that after a certain number of hours or days, you get that Zoom fatigue and you get the headache and you think, wait a minute, this is absolutely terrible. My work meetings, my kids' classes, our family holidays, worship services, they're all blending into one thing. We're all in one place all the time. And that's absolutely true. Everything we do on this platform or you do on those parallel platforms is being captured by the companies that provide you with the space. This is why I want you to think about space and digital spaces. Whatever company's tool you're using, right now we're using Zoom, but I've mentioned Microsoft, Google, Facebook. What we do here, they have records of. They have information on who was here, with whom, how long did you stick around for, what did you talk about? And long after this Zoom call ends, that record of those conversations lives on the servers and as the property of the companies whose tools we're using. In addition to that, which is true of all software, almost all software that we use these days, the companies are deciding how it is we actually interact in this space. For example, here on Zoom, only one person can speak at a time. Now, I don't know about your family, but that's not how a conversation around my family dinner table usually goes. There's usually an awful lot of people talking at one time. In addition, they've decided, okay, we're going to talk over here and you can type to somebody in the chat bar and we'll even give you an option that tells you it's private. But you've probably learned by now, 7 months into the pandemic, that even if you're hitting that private button, that record is fully available to the hosts of the meeting at the end of the day, if they've recorded the call. Not just the public chat, but the private chat. So hopefully you've learned that you should be very careful about what you say over there about your boss, or your mother, or your rabbi, or your kids teacher, all of whom you're likely to be talking about over there in the Zoom chat bar. So if you start to metaphorically think of Zoom as a physical space, imagine we were actually in a room where we could gather in 3 dimensions. It would be the equivalent of a very tightly controlled space. The chairs wouldn't move, the acoustics would be terrible. There'd be a global mute button that allowed one voice to be heard at any time. And it would be full of closed circuit cameras and recording devices that none of us actually had the on-off switch for. And digital spaces like Zoom are as designed and architected as such a physical space would be. The physical world version of Zoom that I just described, that very uncomfortable room, would be both visually and viscerally oppressive. And it would have been intentionally constructed that way, as I want you to realize the space we're in right now has been intentionally constructed this way. And after a couple of days, if we were back in 3 dimensions and you actually did have to have all of your meetings in such a oppressive space where you couldn't move the chairs and only one person could talk at a time and you were being recorded everywhere, chances are you'd say to whoever you were with, either your family or your congregation or your neighbors or your work colleagues or whoever it was, enough of this. Let's go outside to a park, to a cafe, to my living room, anywhere but here. This is a terrible space. You would in fact choose a physical space that felt different, that was different, that gave you more control or allowed small conversations, not by typing, but by talking, and a space that you had control of, even if it meant you could just move the chairs. You choose a different physical setting so you could be more comfortable, more in control, more human, and more private. Now, what you're looking at here is the beta mock-up of essentially a different kind of Zoom being created right now by yet another company that says, oh my gosh, no more boxes. Let's put people in circles. Let's make it so that they could have small conversations within big conversations, so that you could literally, in a Zoom type room, in a video conference room, two of us could go over to the side and talk to each other and hear each other. And the rest of the room would be having its bigger meeting, sort of like what happens in any classroom I've ever been, or any office meeting I've ever showed up for. You've got the main conversation and you've got all this side stuff. You'd be able to move from group to group, the way you do at a cocktail party, or might have done once upon a time at a cocktail party, or a playground, or in the hallway outside of a board meeting. Over the next year, we're going to see zillions of these. There's going to be all kinds of modifications, all kinds of new opportunities to redesign these digital spaces so that our two-dimensional behavior becomes a little bit more like our three-dimensional behavior. Because for those, I don't know who on the call may have any experience in actually coding software, writing any software, the software can do any of these things. It doesn't have to be small boxes in a Brady Bunch framework. It could be circles. You could talk differently. You could make the sound do different things. It's designed and architected to serve the purposes of the company that makes it. As the world has moved on to these platforms, there's a market opportunity for people to create new ones. Trust me, this is a sure bet. We'll see a whole bunch of these alternatives, and we'll see Zoom and the major companies adapt some of these while we go through the next year. Zoom next year may not look like Zoom this year. Regardless of that, however, you'll still be meeting in that software on a company's server. Even if they change the interface, even if they make it friendlier for us to move around and more like we were in 3 dimensions, they'll still know where you are, who you're with, how long you stuck around, and who said what. In other words, the designers and the techies, they can keep making the 2 dimensions better, more human, more fun, more flexible. But the business model keeps gathering all the data. Go back to my physical space metaphor of a moment ago. A year from now, we'll be able to move the chairs around the room on our video conferences, but our landlord, which is the company that makes the software that we're using, will still be guarding the doors to the room, running the cameras and the microphones, and storing a record of everything that happens. And that's precisely how I want you to think about software and digital systems, as your landlord. Not just today, not just during the pandemic or during this class, but when you log off of this call and go back to doing whatever you were doing, or when you log back onto class tomorrow or go back to work. If you happen to be a very skilled, very committed user of open source software that you run on your own servers using hardware that you built yourself, and you've built and are running your very own cloud, then congratulations. You are your own landlord. But for the rest of us, we're tenants. We're tenants in these digital spaces, and we have very few rights and even less awareness of how constrained the space actually is. Now, the shorthand term you hear for this a lot, especially if you read tech criticism or paying attention to any of the discussions about the big tech companies these days, or certainly if you've paid attention to some of the misinformation conversation given the election. The shorthand for this, a lot of it gets captured into a term privacy. And as Cindy knows, and many of them on the call know, privacy lawyers and privacy advocates and privacy rights scholars can talk 15 ways from Sunday about what they mean by privacy. But I don't want you to tune this out as a privacy issue, because it's a dangerous shorthand, because what it's really about, in addition to privacy, is about control, choice, participation, equity. Some of those same values that we talked about earlier as being fundamental to this ethos of democracy. That's all captured in this term, privacy. So how did we get here? How did we get to a place where that's the those technological those tech companies and their products are so determinative or so influential? I shouldn't say determinative, but very influential on how we do what we do. Again, not brought on by the pandemic, revealed, heightened, accelerated, exacerbated, but absolutely present for the last decades prior to this. So how we got here? Lots of ways. I mean, first of all, we've got these technologies in us, on us, and all around us. And in the technologies you see here on the screen, you don't even have to have left your home. You've got all this stuff going on and you're still inside your home. We got here, we've brought on all this technology into our lives. Convenience, marketing, sales, vanity. We record ourselves before we even leave the house. If you sleep with a Fitbit on or have a smart thermometer in your house, as is shown on this slide, you're online when you're asleep. Your house is collecting data on you. Then when you leave the house, we've built all of this same capacity into our built environment. And we've grown so used to some of these things, we don't even think about them. But those are New York-based pictures. Well, the one on the top right is actually from Detroit. But that's the streetscape of New York. Every one of those devices tracks you coming and going. So it's in our homes, it's all around us in our mobility services. I don't know if they're showing this ad in New York or wherever you are, but there's this ad on the right for this Buick actually insists it's not a Buick, it's an Alexa. It's not a car, it's a recording device. That's their advertising motto. So they're not trying to hide this. That's another way we got here. And then as importantly as these kind of everyday, pervasive, all around us examples of data collection technology are the things that we see sort of what might be argued as a cutting edge, although not a cutting edge in a positive way. For example, this is a Stingray device, which is something that police departments use to intercept your cell signal. You think you're connecting to a cell signal, but you're actually connecting to the police Stingray device. There's a real-time facial recognition vans on the streets of London. And I don't know how many people know this, but oftentimes these automated speed limit readouts are actually hiding cameras that are capturing your automobile license plate. So they're sort of duping you there. So the technology is creeping and creeping and creeping into more and more aspects of our life, as was written the other day about a certain company who you can probably guess. The steady drumbeat of new releases from the company push the boundaries of, again, privacy and hints at a strategy of pushing as far as the market will bear and then reshaping what the threshold can be. There's actually many companies we could write that about. But we're just in this constant pushing of this limit about just how far we can go. One other way in which to think about this, I read earlier this week, here in California, there's a ballot proposition on the November election that would actually undo a labor law that was passed specifically to rein in the companies like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, and the way they classify their drivers as contractors and not as employees. This was a law written specifically to apply to these companies. The companies subsequently turned around and are spending $90 million to rewrite the law to not apply to them. But what I want to bring up for you here is the fact that as they're spending that $90 million in advertising and political outreach to get this new ballot proposition passed, they're using the very data they collected on you when you took a ride in the rideshare or when you ordered takein through DoorDash, because they have so much information on you and what you like and where you went and where you're going and where you live and where you often frequent or what have you, that they can use that data now to make very targeted political advertising. And I'm sure I would be highly surprised if there's anyone on this call who hasn't been inundated in the last weeks or months by very targeted text messages and email advertisements from the major political campaigns, both for candidates at all levels as well as for issues. So what's the point of all this? I want you to think about it this way. We don't go online anymore. We're always online. If you wired your home or wired your wrist or wired your mattress, if you're lucky, you may be offline every now and then. But chances are you're actually living your life as a constant generator of digital data that is constantly being collected by a whole panoply of companies, very few of whom you're paying much attention to. That's the context in which both civil society seeks to operate, we seek to operate as individuals, and our democratic formal systems of government are operating. In other words, as Laura Denardis, a professor at American University, writes, we are living in a world with no off switch. And that's a different world than the one we've lived in for years. It's a very different world than the one that American civil society, the nonprofit and philanthropic sector, was designed for or evolved within. So let me take a second here to talk a little bit specifically about this other idea, what you call here at the lab, digital civil society. Now, we've already reached the point when that we could get rid of the digital, because our argument is that all of civil society is now as digitally dependent as everything I've just argued. There's no exception. You either are spending your time not paying attention to your digital dependencies. If you're an active protester, you're probably taking a lot of steps to protect some of your digital trail, but you're either in it and not knowing, or you're in it and probably trying to get out of it. Those are our options. What is it? What is digital civil society? Well, it's a pretty simple definition. It's the same thing civil society was before, all the ways we voluntarily use private resources for public benefit, but in the digital age. And that in the digital age is meant to capture both our reliance on these digital systems, our dependence on them, and the ways in which our behavior is in fact captured and nudged and shaped by the ways our digital tools work. But also the fact that while we for years had the ability to donate and contribute money and time, that's charitable giving and volunteering in nonprofit speak, we now also have the opportunity to give away digital data. And that's a whole new ballgame. Now, I have a book coming out on this in 2021, but I'm not even going to mention it because it's not coming out for a year. We'll talk about that another time. Happy to do a talk specifically about what it would mean to give digital data. But I want you to just understand this definition of digital civil society. And then if you think about this, if you think about these dependencies that we've built and the ways we are tied to these digital systems, you find that this very familiar picture, probably for anyone who took civics in public school, certainly when I took it in public high school in New York, we were taught that democracy works with these three related and adjacent sectors. There's the government, there's the marketplace, there's this independent sector, as we like to call it in the United States civil society. This is a sort of fundamental idea in Western liberal democracy, both theoretically and historically. And we, again, and if this were a political science class, we could talk, and perhaps we will, about why that's important and why that overdrawn in this bad picture degree of independence really matters. But there's a sense that there's some distinction between these three different spaces. And I would argue that in an age that we're in now, when we are entirely dependent on software and technology and telecommunication systems that are market-based and government surveilled, that there is no independence, that civil society is no longer separate from the market and the government by courtesy of these digital ties. Which leads me to the new book that's coming out next month, in which I and my co-editors, Ellen Landemore of Yale and Rob Reich of Stanford, as well as a dozen really quite wonderful co-authors, Archon Fong, Josh Cohen, David Lee, Margaret Levy, many others, actually propose that maybe it's time for new democratic theory. But the digital technology is here to stay. The digital dependencies and affordances, and what we really need to do is update what we think democratic theory is all about. So that book is coming out, like I said, next month. And a lot of it, this talk is influenced by the work I did with my 15 co-authors and editors. And I'm really quite proud of this book. So I'd encourage you again to realize that what we think democracy is and what it might actually need to be, first and foremost, it needs to take into account the depth and reach of these technological dependencies. So with all of that, where do we need to go? I mean, there's got to be a future. There's got to be a better, right? There's got to be a way forward. When we think about this at the Digital Civil Society Lab, when we think about the nature of those dependencies, of the way in which we've lost this independent space in which we assemble and we build associations and we express ourselves, and quite importantly, we protest, and where the work to make our formal government systems more inclusive, more equitable, more participatory, actually the pursuit of those values we so grandly just claimed 200 and some years ago, then we actually need to think very differently about what is in civil society, what kinds of organizational structures are there, what laws apply, and how we use technology. So very quickly, let me tell you, I'm not so sure I know how to save democracy, but I can tell you what I know digital civil society absolutely needs to be and needs to be doing. We absolutely need to be using different technologies than those that are simply handed to us or sold to us or given to us for quote unquote free by companies. We have to build and use and pursue technologies that are less surveillant, that are less extractive of not just our data, but essentially our identity and all of our relationships, all of our expression, all of those whom we associate with. What you see here are some logos for some software too you might be very familiar with, the Firefox browser, the Signal encrypted messaging app. These are technologies that don't default to the purely data extractive, purely surveillant nature that powers so much of our easily available software. Almond is a new, an emerging technology. You may have noticed, you may even do this, that an awful lot of people no longer access the internet by typing. They talk to something. Back in that Alexa ad, or the Buick ad I showed at the front of the slide deck, we talk to our cars, right? So voice activated software is a whole new frontier, and we needed alternatives. Because right now we're locked in again to what Google will let us do, Apple, Facebook, or Amazon. They control all the ways in to the internet by voice, and that's problematic. I mentioned that we need different organizational structures in digital civil society, and we've already got them. They're all around us. They're all around us. We're surrounded by things like the Missing Maps Project, which are actually distributed volunteers who use real-time satellite data, digital data, to create maps that can then be used by emergency responders when there's a natural disaster. And they're depended upon. They're a fundamental part of our emergency response infrastructure now, is this distributed group of volunteers from all around the world. Missing Maps is only one example of this. But that doesn't look like a not-for-profit 501c3. But it's smack dab in the middle of civil society, of digital civil society. There's a new effort launched by a democracy reform activist out of Argentina called Open Collective. It's literally an alternative to the 501c3. It's a digitally native, if you will, a terrible term, but a purposefully digital organizational structure that allows people to take action collectively, track the money, make decisions, all in a very transparent form, but it's built for the digital age. So it doesn't have things like articles of incorporation in the state of Delaware, and may not last forever. It may be just in time and just to get the thing done. And then there are things like data trust, civic data trust, where people are saying, actually, if you think of the not-for-profit organization as a mechanism by which you donate money and time and turn it into public good, well, how on earth are we going to do this with digital data? And that's it. Data trusts, data collaboratives, there's a number of different names for these, is an effort at inventing what I think may well become the 21st century nonprofit form, which is an organizational explicitly designed to safely, equitably, and effectively donate digital data, private digital data for public purpose. Because we don't have any such thing, because we didn't need it in 1890. Finally, the legal boundaries of the not-for-profit sector and the philanthropic sector are not bound anymore by charitable law and tax law. We've got to understand as a sector that our very ability to operate now depends on the laws that shape the digital space within which we operate. So privacy law matters. The Section 230, a law from 20 years ago that most of you wish you didn't know about, it's on the front page of the paper today, the Communications Decency Act. It's on the front page of the paper today. It's a key electoral issue. It's a key electoral tactic of the current administration right now. And it has huge implications for what we do in collective action and civil society. Facial recognition and the ability to be scanned and recorded and captured, and our images held by governments and companies without our knowledge. All of this shapes the way we could possibly even imagine taking collective action, coming together in an associational form, or protesting. These are the laws that matter, not the tax code, not the charitable corporate statute, these laws. And it's well past time that the nonprofit and philanthropic sector got into these policy issues. I've got a link here for a report we wrote last year that actually offers very concrete strategies for how to do that. Because of course the expertise about digital policies that would be more equitable, less surveillant, and more focused on justice, guess where they come from? They come from civil society. We're the ones who are going to invent these alternatives because industry has already showed us what they'll build, and we know what the government wants. If we want technologies and we want policies that actually protect our ability to express ourselves, assemble, and associate, they're going to come from us. It is on us to do this work. There's another type of law I want to bring your attention to specifically in this particular moment, 3 weeks out from an election. The policy boundaries of civil society are not only defined by the laws of charitable law and corporate code and these digital laws, but they're very much defined by the basic ways or the ways in which governments continue to restrict our ability to exercise those fundamental First Amendment rights. And here I'm not talking about free expression. I'm not talking about free speech. We have got to wake up to the fact that what has happened to free speech on the internet is happening to our right to to assembly in physical space. And as I sit here, there are 120 some odd laws around the country being proposed or legislated or ruled on that limit the right to protest. And at the root of the right of protest is the root of our right to assembly and association. And so if the nonprofit sector and the philanthropic sector sit back and think, oh, these attempts to cut down on who can gather where don't attend to us, you are missing the future. Efforts to cut this off are a slippery slope to efforts to cut off other forms of associational opportunity and basic assembly rights. That's right where we're headed. And of course, while not all of these laws are actually about digital policies, go back to the picture I showed you of the facial recognition van on the street of London, or the license plate reader that makes you think it's just capturing your speeding, whether or not you're going to get a speeding ticket. They are very much accelerated by the type of digital surveillance we're all dependent on. So what does digital civil society need to become? We need to be watching the watchers. We need to be the ones proposing the alternatives. We need to be the ones saying these behaviors by corporate technology companies are absolutely denigrating to our democracy. They're denigrating to our ability to express ourselves, to assemble, and to associate. And we need different rules. There's no time to waste. So there are two in particular that's really the answer to the where we need to go question, but I want to point you to two very specific opportunities within that broader frame, and then I'm going to wrap this up in another minute or so. There are an emerging conversation, a growing conversation, a critical conversation about the infrastructure itself, the digital infrastructure, which right now many of you probably think the digital infrastructure or the digital infrastructure that is actually running your life, and you could do a quick inventory of this, probably consists of some combination of Apple, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, maybe Uber and DoorDash. But that's not the infrastructure. Those are the companies that have been built on it, but they're acting like the infrastructure, and we need to take the infrastructure back. We need to think very differently and build very differently, both the technology, the rules, and most importantly, the governance mechanisms to make sure that we have a digital infrastructure that actually allows young people in the city of New York to go to school during a pandemic, let alone young people in rural areas or on tribal lands in the remote West. We don't have a digital infrastructure that serves our basic needs in this pandemic. And we haven't had it for decades. And the pandemic has revealed just how fractured and captured it is, and it's time to build alternatives. I invite you to join us on the final slide of this deck. There's a URL for a conference we're hosting next week at Stanford, where these ideas and a parallel one by the Siegel Family Endowment, which is based in Manhattan, are coming together to really talk about what an infrastructure for 21st century healthy lives, thriving communities actually looks like. And it very much includes a very different ownership structure and governance structure for the digital infrastructure on which we depend. That's the first opportunity. The second big opportunity is to recognize, and here's where philanthropy, nonprofits, and scholars have an enormous responsibility. We are learning moment by moment as we head to the November 3rd election about all the ways that our online expressive systems have been captured, manipulated, and used to spread falsehoods, lies, and propaganda. There's no doubt about it. Used by many different actors in many different ways, the system is fundamentally destructive of the public discourse that we believe is critical to democracy. And I argue that while we're sitting here finally grappling with that reality, the same reality is leaving our screens, moving to our streets, and we will soon face the effects of that same kind of digital capture of our physical spaces, the result being a suppression of assembly. We don't have time like we don't have the kind of time we've had in the past to come to grips with this. We need to get ahead of this now. And when I say digital assembly, I want to be very clear. And if you flash back to those slides of how connected we are, whether we're in our bedroom or at work, this refers to assembly in online spaces, such as we're doing right here and now. It refers to our ability to assemble in physical spaces, whether that's outside of the White House, in Lafayette Square Park, or in Jefferson Square Park in Louisville, where people are still protesting the death of Breonna Taylor, the murder of Breonna Taylor. But I also remember that those are no longer separate spaces, that we actually live in the liminality between them, that your social media trails, your rideshare use, your shopping habits, and your screen time, all of that data follows you wherever you go. And if we're really going to pursue some kind of democracy, if we're really going to try to improve the one we have, protect and improve it, then we really need to understand that when we talk about the spaces, the physical, legal, cultural, ideological spaces in which we are pursuing the ideas of participation, equality, and self-governance, those spaces are both physical and digital. And we, the people, need to control them in order to maintain our ability to assemble and associate as we undertake the pursuit of participation and equality. Thanks very much. There's just this one last slide with some links that may be useful to you. Thanks for having me, and Cindy, I'll toss it back to you.
Excellent, Lucy. Thank you so much for this. We've got there's so much in that discussion. And I really look forward to reading the book too, because I know you're going to be able to really explicate even further there in the following book, the following year. We talk a lot about these kinds of issues in our program and in different courses. And I see a number of our faculty and students online here tonight with us. I want to pose a question, I guess, that it somewhat aggregates my own query and several that I'm seeing in our Q&A chat. So historically, as you said, there were the three different aspects, the three different sectors, and ours in civil society was very much dependent in some ways on government or on the markets to create the spaces that we could still, the infrastructure that we would utilize. Examples being the postal service, right? Or something else that we were, having to utilize. I also think about the fact that the analog for media, old school, we would have things like C-SPAN. We had PBS created. We recognized a need in the past that we needed a different type of environment in which to receive media, information, et cetera, correct? So we may have used technologies that were old, but we were trying to create something new. And thinking about now then, what would be the single best step that we could take to actually create that space? And as you put it, not just for our sector, but it has now become completely mapped with the other two as well. And I think a lot about this with one of our own Columbia folks, with Tim Wu's theory for a very long time around net neutrality, and that these types of infrastructures essentially should be considered utilities now. Yep. And everyone should have access to them, because even if there is a market to be had, and I remember cracking a joke the first week of lockdown, and you sure hoped you'd already invested in Zoom because it was going to come to pass. It shouldn't be completely dependent on only that. So the question that I guess I'm posing to you is, what do you see as the single best step that we could take in civil society to help encourage and inculcate an innovation that would serve all of these sectors, because we're all supposed to be dovetailing at the end of the day for society and globally, so that everyone could have access in a way that heretofore we're not seeing in the digital space?
So thank you for the question. And I, as I mentioned, this upcoming series on digital public infrastructure, one of the sessions in that series is about something that is being called a corporation for public software, precisely to take us back to the public media, public broadcasting alternative. And I think, that's a good idea. It's important, I think, and I do hope people will join us for that series. It's the information is at the link here, but it's also a bigger and more amorphous and inchoate idea right now than what you just asked me. So let me give you a very specific answer about what I think every nonprofit and every foundation and every civil society actor of any sort right now in this country ought to be doing. And that is taking whatever political action they're familiar with taking to implement universal public broadband, universal community broadband. We can't educate our children right now. There are kids sitting outside of Taco Bell's trying to go to school. We can't get health care right now because we don't have access to the infrastructure. This is like saying, okay, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, you don't get any sewers, right? It can't stand. And it has to be public for two reasons. One, we have been subsidizing the telcos for 40 years to do this, and they have failed to do it. They have no intention of doing it. So that's a ridiculous path to keep going down. And secondly, it needs to be public because we don't have private sewers either, right? We probably do somewhere in this country, right? We need it because we need it, because it is a utility, because it's a requirement. And it's so I just want to say one other thing I mentioned in passing, I went by it very quickly, but Laura Denardis's book, The Internet and Everything, is absolutely critical for civil society to get it right on this. Because if we continue to think about internet dependencies as being about communications, so there you have, and the example is, right, we had a corporation for public broadcasting, so we need a corporation for public software. If we limit ourselves to thinking of this as an expression technology, we miss the fact that in fact, right now, you cannot participate in the civic life of New York City, in the civic life of the political life, if you don't have broadband access, because the city hall hearings are all online. You can't be a citizen. You can't do your civic duty, let alone go to school, let alone go to work, right? The internet, in other words, no longer just shapes our space for communicating. It shapes our space for living. It's as fundamental as electricity. And I say that in California, where we don't have a reliable source of either. So yes, the practical answer is get involved in the efforts that are underway. There are policy proposals, there's organizations that exist. We absolutely need universal public broadband infrastructure. And then in a larger sense, this is about fundamentally taking back our digital infrastructure from the corporate logic that's built it to date.
No, it's interesting. I appreciate that. It's interesting. And one of our other questions was actually about the fact that the digital divide, social, racial equity protests this summer and this fall have really laid bare that divide again. But there's been a long discussion years ago around if we went to electronic voting, thinking that that would somehow make it easier for people to participate. And yet here we are all these years later, if we actually, quote, remedied our situation that we're having right now with the postal service, or people, you know, implying that there's going to be an issue with the postal service. If we thought the answer was digitization of voting, we would see that that would be a huge issue at this point, still after all this time, right?
Sure,
So
we would have just shifted the problem, but we also would have entered all kinds of security problems that, you know,
right.
Because actually, you know, the mail operates under a set of public rules. I mean, that are being violated left and right, don't get me wrong, but the truth is still that I go to jail if I open your mail, Cindy.
Right.
Nobody at Google goes to jail when they read our emails.
Right, it's a felony. So single best steps, it sounds like this is what we're going to be focused on. You guys have a conference on this, and are there lots of entrants in this space right now from civil society, or are there very few, but they're notable?
What's happened really, this is a conversation, so the idea of digital public infrastructure has gone around and around. It's been with us really since the beginning of the internet. There's a new moment here. I think there's new political will as philanthropists and nonprofits and parents realize, oh my goodness, we really actually don't have the basic infrastructure we need. There's also been some very important new framing of it. I linked to Ethan Zuckerman's paper, the Siegel Family Endowment. The American Academy of Science put out a great paper on democracy, and Strategy 5 is about a new civic information infrastructure. So there's a lot of both practical examples on the ground. In Detroit, there are communities in Detroit, for example, have been building their own internet for decades because they were redlined by the telcos, right? Same in Red Hook, Brooklyn. You've got lots, so there's both is the answer to your question. So a lot of experimentation on the ground, and there's a lot of very important framing that can draw the attention both of, I think, the big philanthropy, but more important, the big public policy players, because to your point, Cindy, ultimately the infrastructure is going to be built by governments. What we need is public oversight of it. That's civil society doing its job in democracy, which is pushing the government to provide the services that are needed for all of the people.
I find it interesting that, you know, someone's asked this question, and I'll riff on it just a bit around the different models in terms of privacy. And I appreciated your points that you don't actually want to have privacy sometimes set up as a red herring. And the way that I see that, that's legally and for policy purposes, the way I see that, you know, in the United States, this is just the fact, and it's partly your reference to the Communications Decency Act. The issue here is that Americans have to opt out. Once you've gone in and you've purchased or you're on the platform, you have to opt out. If you look now, when you go onto anything, you know, look at The Guardian or anything that comes out of the UK that Americans might look at very routinely, you have to kind of opt in. Your choices around the cookies and all that. That's the difference of the EU model versus like the American model. But it's hidden in some ways in the American model because it makes it look like it's more democratic, because somehow you're saying, we're all in. But the difference is we were all in to a corporate model.
Yeah.
So then you have to opt out of what is a corporate model.
Yeah.
But it looks on its surface as if we're all in. And I think that's where the privacy piece and opting out has been co-opted, so to speak, by the corporate world to say that we're here and, you know, we're from the corporate technology world and we're here to help.
Yeah.
We used to be concerned that government would say that. Now we should be concerned that technology companies say it. When in fact, there may be something, you know, there are many things, as you pointed out, that they're actually quite happy to have everybody, you know, as a default bought in right at the start. And then everyone has to opt out if they don't want that. And it seems this is the connection to one of the questions we've had here from the audience around privacy issues, but also limiting freedom of assembly, of having that the figure that you showed with the map, the different legislative efforts across the United States to limit assembly, or at least to limit in terms of how we think about it for protesting, and how much is being collected online with that, and how would we even know? I mean, as an attorney, my question would be, oh yeah, well, how do they enforce it? Well, the way you enforce it is through digital technology, because that's how you are. Which is
so
great.
Yeah, just flash back to those horrifying news stories of a month or so ago of the streets of Portland, Oregon, where these unmarked vans showed up and randomly put people in the van. So everything is wrong with that picture, but most importantly, there was nothing random about it. There's absolutely nothing random about it. Those people who were put in the van, their social media trails were followed. There was a digital shadow of that individual that told whoever was driving the mysterious white van exactly who to focus on. And there's enough closed circuit television cameras around the city to figure out where the person is. I mean, it's very easy to figure out where you are at any point in time. Again, that's what I'm trying to say by the idea of digital assembly is really complicated because it has these three components that are so related. It's what we do here, it's what we do in physical space, and it's the fact that following us everywhere we go is the shadow that we just keep voluntarily contributing to in so many ways, as well as involuntarily have captured from us.
Yeah. Yep. I like the shadow idea from the large logical corporate sons. Yeah. This has been amazing, Lucy. We could talk about this for many, many more hours. We've covered some of the questions, many of the questions actually in some form or another that were here tonight. So I appreciate that. Everybody should know that this is going to be recorded, or it has been recorded, and it's going to be on the website for access. And lots of other questions we could ask. So I'm assuming, Lucy, if folks want to follow up with you, they can track you down easily through technology to your web address and your email at Stanford. I want to thank Stanford also for letting us steal you for the evening. It's really a delight, as always, just to speak with you. I've had the good fortune of being able to work with Lucy in the past on various conferences or panels, and it's always a delight. So my pleasure to host you this time. This is a slide just to let folks know that we've got lots of different events coming up at the program level still, and that's not even incorporating all that our school and other programs are doing as well. And as always, you can find out what we're doing by following social media and making sure you're checking your email, as well as using your uni if you're an alum, so that you can actually see your Columbia email again. And there you have our social media. I want to thank our team for putting this together, the staff that's behind the scenes right now. Again, Stanford, and most of all, heartfelt thanks to Dr. Bernholz, as always, for participating and enlightening. I have gotten 15 ideas here just for my own research and thinking what we might be able to do. So really, really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you
Thanks so much for having me.
Good evening. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.